One of the common misunderstandings of objectivism is that people confuse objectivism with moral absolutism, and the two views are not the same. And often when people argue for subjectivism or relativism, they'll contrast those views with absolutism, claim that absolutism is implausible, and then infer that relativism or subjectivism is true. But it doesn't follow, because the main two divisions between the moral theories are objectivism and, on the other side, the relativist subjectivist view. So when people talk about moral absolutism and they attack moral absolutism, this is what they usually have in mind. They tend to think that if moral absolutism is true, then you should never lie, no matter what the circumstances. Lying is always wrong. Or you should never break a promise, no matter what the circumstances. Breaking a promise is always wrong. But that's not what the objectivist is saying. The objectivist is only saying this: what makes an act right or wrong doesn't depend on you or me and how we feel about that act. The objectivist isn't claiming there are absolute moral laws that should never be violated. The objectivist could think lying is wrong in most cases, but there are legitimate cases where you ought to lie. But it's being the case that you ought to lie wouldn't depend on how we feel, but on some objective moral fact. In fact, objectivism is pretty pliable, pretty flexible. The objectivist would say something like this: it's morally wrong to insult another person, but they would recognize that what counts as an insult can vary from culture to culture. So there may be some cultures in which belching after a meal is considered rude, an insult. In other cultures, belching after a meal may be considered a compliment to the chef. The objectivist says this: you shouldn't insult people, which means in the one culture, you shouldn't belch after the meal, and perhaps in the other culture, you should belch after the meal. So notice the flexibility there. But that's not the same thing as relativism, because the objectivist is saying it's a moral fact that we shouldn't insult other people, and that doesn't depend on how we feel about insulting other people. That doesn't depend on how the culture feels about insulting other people. What the objectivist is really saying is that there are universal moral laws that apply to all people at all times, not that there are absolute moral laws that should never, ever be violated. Now, when the objectivist says that there are universal moral laws that apply to everyone, you have to be sure to recognize that the objectivist is not saying that people tend to agree on what those laws are, or that most people throughout history have endorsed the same moral laws. The objectivist is not talking about what most people believe. The objectivist is not talking about what most cultures accept. The objectivist is trying to tell us what makes an act right or wrong. So you can't try to disprove objectivism by saying, well, objectivism can't be true because in the past people have disagreed about certain moral issues and they still do so today. It's not the case that everyone agrees about every moral issue, but that's a bad objection because the objectivist is not claiming that everyone agrees. Just as a scientist, when they say the Earth is flat, or round, or that objects fall at 9.8 meters per second squared, they're not talking about what most people believe. They're talking about the things. They're talking about gravity. They're talking about the shape of the Earth. If objectivism is true, then it could be that there's some moral issue about which most of us have been wrong and will continue to be wrong. There could be a moral issue where even all of us are wrong. We all happen to have the wrong belief. We're all mistaken. Whereas if subjectivism is true, that's not possible. We're always right. And if cultural relativism is true, then the culture is morally infallible. So keep in mind that in discussing these moral theories, we're not describing what people believe. We're not really interested in that. What we're interested in is moral rightness and goodness itself.